The 11th of June 1962. 3 prisoners. 1 island. An impossible escape. That day, something happened that left the United States in shock. 3 men escaped from the most secure prison in the country and were never seen again. How did they do it? Are they dead or still free? The fugitives. Frank Lee Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin. Seasoned criminals, experts in bank robberies, and also in escaping from places no one had ever escaped from. Their plan was meticulous. First, they dug a hole behind the wall of their cells. Then, they climbed up to the roof. They descended to the northern shore of the island. And from there, they launched themselves into the sea on a homemade raft built with stolen raincoats. After that, silence. They were never heard from again. No trace. No bodies. Nothing. Did they make it? Did they die trying? For more than 6 decades, the FBI tried to answer that question. And to this day, it remains unsolved. But there's something we do have: evidence, testimonies, and buried secrets. And in this video, we're going to uncover each one of them. Before we analyze that historic night, we need to understand where they were. Because Alcatraz was not an ordinary prison. It was a cage designed to contain the most feared criminals in the country. Al Capone, Mickey Cohen, Bumpy Johnson, Whitey Bulger, Machine Gun Kelly. They all passed through there. And they all knew the same thing. Escaping from Alcatraz wasn't an option, it was a death sentence. The prison of despair. Alcatraz was unlike any other. It wasn't just a prison. It was punishment in the form of an island. A rock isolated by icy waters, where hopelessness was part of the furniture. Its story began after the Civil War in the late 19th century. In its early years, it served as a military prison. There they sent in subordinate soldiers, deserters, and political enemies of the government. But it was in 1912 when Alcatraz began to transform. That massive concrete structure we all recognize today, the gigantic central block, was built by the prisoners themselves. 600 cells, the largest reinforced concrete building in the world at that time. And that's how the nickname that would make it legendary was born: The Rock. In 1934, Alcatraz ceased to be military. It became a federal penitentiary. Its purpose was clear: to lock up the most dangerous men in the country. Those impossible to control. Those who had already escaped from other prisons. Those who had nothing left to lose. Murderers, kidnappers, gangsters, bank robbers. It was the ultimate solution to the crime wave that had overflowed during the Great Depression. And to make things clear from the very first day, the Attorney General of the time wrote, "I wanted to create a prison for the most unmanageable prisoners. I spoke with President Roosevelt, and with his approval, I chose San Francisco Bay. I supervised every step. I selected the warden, the guards, and designed the place as the ultimate symbol of isolation." Alcatraz wasn't just a prison. It was a brutal social experiment. In this new model of incarceration, inmates had no names. They had numbers. The goal was simple: to strip them of their identity, to break them from within. And to achieve that, extreme measures were imposed. The conditions were inhumane. Only the bare essentials: basic food, water, clothing, and limited medical care. Newspapers? Forbidden. Radio? No. Letters? Only if you behaved well. Work? You had to earn it. Library? Limited access. But nothing compared to the cruelest of all: the rule of silence. During the first years, speaking was forbidden. In the cell, in the dining hall, at work. 0 words. Not a single one. It was so extreme that it caused outbreaks of insanity. So many that the rule had to be abolished by the late 1932. The gangster William Henry Ambrose explained it better than anyone. Capone didn't go insane, but he was close. They threw him in the hole 3 or 4 times just for talking. Here, you couldn't say anything. Not at the table, not at work, not in your cell. It's the toughest prison I've ever seen. The hopelessness consumes you, all of you. James A. Johnston, the first warden of Alcatraz as a federal prison, was the one who designed that ruthless system. He wanted a maximum security prison in every sense. And for that, he needed maximum surveillance. He hired more guards than any other prison in the country, one for every 3 inmates. Does that sound excessive? In other prisons, a single guard could oversee 12, 20, even 30 prisoners. Here, they conducted 12 head counts a day. 12. Every single day. They wanted to prove to the nation that they were determined to stop crime. And yes, they did, at the cost of the inmates' sanity. Charlie Bura, one of the most feared prisoners of the 1932nd, said, "Alcatraz wasn't a prison. It was a place without hope. A mental prison. The only thing that kept me going was imagining that one day I'd get out of there." Another, even more heartbreaking testimony came from inmate Jim Quillen, number A586. "We lived without a future. It was the only way to exist. You knew your young life was over. I myself was in that desperate mental state, knowing I could never get it back." Many prisoners were tough men, but even they began to break. Because the cruelest thing about Alcatraz was that freedom was right there, just across the water. From your cell, you could see San Francisco. The lights, the movement, the life. Sometimes, you could even hear the laughter of women sailing on tourist boats near the island. And that was an invisible torture, a constant reminder of what you had lost forever. The years passed, and with each day, the soul wore down. Some accepted their sentence. Others simply gave up. But many, so many, began to think the same thing. I have to get out of here, even if it's the last thing I do. And for some, the only way out was the sea. Talking about escape was taboo, but inevitable. In Alcatraz, dreaming of escape was the only thing that kept many sane. Rumors ran through the corridors like forbidden echoes. Stories of others who had tried. Legends that, repeated so many times, began to seem possible. Was the 1962 escape the first? Not even close. Since Alcatraz became a federal prison, there had been 14 documented escape attempts. And if we go back to its military years, more than 35. The deadliest enemy wasn't in the towers or behind the bars. It was in the water. San Francisco Bay has cold, violent, unpredictable currents. Every fugitive had to face the sea, and many didn't survive. Of the 35 attempts during the military era, 17 ended with prisoners drowning. Now, we'll focus on the cases between 1934 and 1962. Because if we want to understand what Morris and the Anglin brothers did, we need to see who inspired them. The first attempt, Joseph Bowers. The 27th of April 1936. The first to try was Joseph Bowers, inmate number 210. He arrived at Alcatraz in September 1934 with a 25-year sentence for attempted robbery. He was part of the first group of inmates sent to the Rock. But from the very beginning, Bowers was a problem. According to medical reports, man of extremely low mental capacity with a hostile attitude, requires strict measures. Doctors suspected he suffered from mental disorders. His fellow inmates considered him unstable, lonely, and desperate. The routine of Alcatraz, combined with the rule of silence, broke him. One day, he refused to work in the laundry. Punishment? 3 months locked in an isolation cell measuring 1.8 by 1.8 meters. In June 1935, he refused again. He shouted, "Send me to the hole, I don't want to work." He was isolated and his food was reduced to a minimum. Then he was reassigned to the garbage incinerator on the west side of the island. A solitary job. But Bowers seemed to endure, until the inevitable happened. It was the 27th of April, 1936, approximately 11 a.m. Guardirbal Chandlas described it this way. I saw Bowers on top of the wire fence. I shouted several times for him to come down, but he didn't respond. I fired twice at the ground. I waited. Then I fired a third time, aiming at his legs. He was hanging from the fence by his hands, his feet toward the cliff. When I returned after alerting the armory, his body had already fallen into the sea. He died upon impact with the rocks. The official version, a failed escape attempt. But not everyone agreed. Roy Gardner, another inmate who witnessed everything, said, "It wasn't an escape attempt. The wind blew some papers out of the incinerator. Bowers tried to retrieve them, as he had been ordered. The guards shouted at him. He replied that he had to pick them up. They shot him dead. He wasn't trying to escape." Another witness, a young guard named Roger, also had doubts. "I saw him climbing the fence, but inward, as if he wanted to get back to the yard. When he managed to get one arm and one leg over, the third shot rang out. He hung there for a few seconds and fell. Was he following orders or losing his mind? Did he try to escape, or was it a fatal misunderstanding? We'll never know. But one thing became clear. Anyone who approached the fence would die. And future fugitives, including Morris and the Anglin brothers, got the message. The second attempt, Cole and Rowe. The 16th of December 1937. The second attempt was different. Cold, calculated, and planned by two professionals. Theodore Ted Cole and Ralph Rowe. Both were bank robbers. Both had long histories of escapes. And both already knew each other from another prison before ending up together in Alcatraz. Ted Cole was described as a ruthless and clumsy killer with a disturbing calm. His record was full of crimes that crossed state lines, robberies, kidnappings, and violence. Ralph Rowe wasn't any better. He also had a decade of bank robberies on his record and was constantly punished for insulting guards, provoking riots, and challenging authority. The two of them were pure dynamite. Ted and Ralph were assigned to a tire repair workshop in an old industrial building on the north side of the island. That building hadn't been reinforced like the rest of Alcatraz. Its bars were still made of soft iron, a relic from the military days. There, they saw their opportunity. For weeks, perhaps months, they secretly filed down the bars of a rear window, taking turns, working in silence, waiting for the right moment. And that moment came, a particularly foggy day, their best ally. It was 1:0 inches, the afternoon. During the head count, both were present in the workshop, as always. But half an hour later, at the next check, they were gone. The escape. Alvin Karpis, one of the most notorious inmates, was a witness. He remembers it like this. "I saw them go out through the window, barefoot, wearing work clothes. Rowe tried to open the lock on a gate, nervous. Cole pushed him aside and opened it with a wrench, completely calm. They went down toward the shore. They carefully passed between tires and barbed wire, and when they reached the water, the current quickly swept them toward the Golden Gate Bridge." Karpis whispered to the other prisoners, "They're gone. Did they make it? Did they really make it?" Minutes later, the alarm went off. The search was immediate, but they found nothing. The deputy warden wrote in his report, "We searched the entire area. No footprints, no clothes, no trace. We combed the island inch by inch." The Coast Guard patrolled the whole zone. But that day, there was an exceptionally high tide. The currents were violent. The official theory: they drowned. A view shared by a San Francisco municipal engineer, quoted in the local press. That day there was an unusually strong tide. A strong swimmer, leaving from Alcatraz, would have been dragged toward the Golden Gate before even exhausting his strength. The authorities settled on that conclusion. But others weren't so sure. As with the 1,962 escape, the trail was lost in the water. But, over time, rumors began to surface. Witnesses claimed to have seen them in bars inland. Others said they had committed robberies after their disappearance. Even a former Alcatraz inmate stated, years later, that he was convinced they had managed to escape. But Karpis, who saw it all, didn't believe it. From the window, we saw the current dragging them away. They were almost reaching a buoy, when suddenly, Rowe disappeared, as if something had pulled him from below. It was strange. Officially, the case remains unsolved. But there was more. An article published in April 1941, years after their disappearance, claimed the following. Rowe and Cole now live in South America. They have spent time in Peru and Chile. They escaped using 2 large oil drums tied together. They only had to hold on while the current carried them. They met an accomplice in Marin County and fled. Today they live comfortably, with plenty of money, and out of reach of the law. Myth or truth? No one can prove it. But one thing became clear to all the inmates still locked up in Alcatraz. Escape was no longer a dream. It was a possibility. The escape of Ted Cole and Ralph Rowe not only shook the authorities, it ignited a spark of hope among the prisoners. For the first time, many thought, if they tried, why shouldn't I? Meanwhile, the prison administration tried to calm the press and public opinion. They promised to reinforce security, especially in the old industrial building, the weak point the fugitives had exploited. But as always, the changes came too late. And that delay gave other inmates the opportunity they were waiting for. The 23rd of May 1938. 3 names: James Lucas, Rufus Franklin, and Thomas Limerick. 3 bank robbers serving long sentences. And a desperate plan. That day, the 3 of them were working in the carpentry shop of the industrial building. They had studied the guards' routines. They knew one guarded their floor, and 2 others were stationed on the roof. The escape began with brutality. Franklin killed the guard on their floor with a hammer. That cleared the way for them to climb to the roof. They wanted to neutralize the other 2, but something went wrong. As soon as they set foot on the rooftop, they were met with gunfire. Limerick was killed instantly. Franklin was wounded. And Lucas managed to hide. The escape ended in disaster. The survivors were captured and sentenced to life imprisonment for the guard's murder. How much must you hate your life to risk it like that? The 13th of January 1939. The 4th escape attempt. This time, a more organized group, and much more dangerous. The names: Arthur, Doc Barker, Dale Stamfill, William Martin, Henry Young, and Rufus McCain. Once again, bank robbers. And it was no coincidence. This type of criminal was the most likely to attempt escape. Accustomed to planning complex heists, moving with precision, and spotting every weakness in the system. Doc Barker was the mastermind. A cold, calculating, determined man. His partner, Henry Young, put it plainly. Barker was unstoppable. Once he got something into his head, only death could stop him. Barker knew the weak points of the prison well. He had worked in the same workshop as Ted Cole and Ralph Rowe. He even helped them get tools. He knew that one day, it would be his turn. And it was. He detected a structural flaw in Block D, the most feared area of the prison. That's where the most dangerous and troublesome inmates were held. The bars were still the originals from 1912. Soft iron. Barker gathered his team. Stamfill, sentenced for robbery and kidnapping, obtained the smuggled tools. Martin, Young, and McCain joined later. On the night of the 13th of January 1939, the plan was set in motion. They had been filing the bars for weeks, hiding the cuts with an improvised sealant. One by one, they slipped through the bars. They climbed the walls, reached the shore. The fog provided cover. They began gathering materials to build an improvised raft. But someone in Block D noticed the cut bars. The alarm was triggered. Guards began to sweep the island. A sentry in the tower spotted them. He shouted for them to surrender. They didn't obey, and he fired. Doc Barker was hit. He died hours later in the hospital. His last words: "I'm completely insane. I should never have tried it. Too many escapes. Too many cracks in the system. The prison administration finally reacted. First, they closed the old industrial building. In its place, they built a new one in 1941, safer, better guarded, more modern. Then, they reinforced Block D. The old bars were replaced with solid steel. But even with those improvements, the escapes didn't stop. The 14th of April 1943. 4 new names: James Borman, Harold Brest, Floyd Hamilton, and Fred Hunter. All robbers, all dangerous. And once again, the weak point was the same: the industrial building. Although officially closed, the lower level was still being used as a workshop. That's where the 4 of them worked. That day, they attacked 2 guards. The first was taken by surprise and tied up. The second became suspicious. The workshop was too quiet. When he tried to run and raise the alarm, they attacked him too. He fought with everything he had, but was overpowered. The 4 inmates escaped through a window. They jumped the fence, and from the shore, they threw themselves into the water. Borman, Brest, and Hamilton swam toward San Francisco. Hunter, injured from a fall, hid in a cave. But from a tower, a guard saw the bodies in the water. He fired his Springfield rifle. One of the inmates, Borman, was shot in the head. His body disappeared into the depths. It was never recovered. Brest was captured in the water. Hunter was rescued by a prison boat. And Hamilton? Everyone thought he was dead. But Floyd Hamilton had not drowned. When he heard the bullets whistling over the water, he turned back and swam toward the island's shore. He found the same cave where Hunter had been hiding, and stayed there, in silence, for 2 days. No food, no water, no hope. Finally, overcome by hunger, he secretly returned to the workshop. And in an ironic twist, the same guard he had taken hostage was the one who found him. Curled up, trembling, defeated. Another curious attempt took place on the 31st of July 1945. The protagonist, John Giles, inmate number AZ-250, convicted of murder. Giles worked on the dock where the Army's dirty laundry arrived. And for months, he had been stealing pieces of a military uniform. When he finally had a complete set, he disguised himself as a soldier, calmly boarded an Army transport ship, and sat among the military personnel. He believed he was heading to San Francisco. But that wasn't the destination. It was Angel Island, just north of Alcatraz. The alarm had already been raised. They intercepted the ship and detained him without resistance. His plan, however clever, turned out to be as useless as it was short-lived. And then came absolute chaos. May 1946. The bloodiest, most violent, and most destructive escape attempt ever seen on the Rock. History would remember it as the Battle of Alcatraz, a date that would forever mark the history of the most feared prison in the United States. An escape attempt that turned into a war. Hostages, stolen weapons, shootouts, explosions. The entire prison was paralyzed for 48 hours. The man behind the plan, Bernard Coy, a bank robber from Kentucky. He was intelligent, calculating, and obsessed with escaping. Coy worked in the main cell block. That gave him a certain freedom of movement. And it was there that he discovered the key weakness. A flaw in the armory that connected to Block C. The bars of the armory could be opened with the right tool. On the 2nd of May 1946, Coy and his accomplice Marvin Hubbard attacked a guard. They took his keys. They freed 2 other inmates, Joseph Kretzer and Clarence Carnes. Then, Coy used a crowbar to open the bars of the armory. He had fasted for weeks so he could squeeze through the bars. Once inside, he took rifles, pistols, ammunition. They were armed. They were determined. And they were trapped. The goal was clear. Take hostages, reach the yard, get to the prison launch, and escape from the island. But there was a problem. The key to the yard wasn't among the ones they had stolen. They tried one after another, and that triggered the security system. The lock jammed permanently. The escape was no longer possible. But they refused to surrender. For 2 days, the prisoners barricaded themselves. They exchanged gunfire with the guards. They threw homemade grenades. They took several officers as hostages. The situation escalated so much that the US Navy had to intervene. The walls shook with every explosion. It was a war inside a prison. Meanwhile, some inmates decided to surrender. Others, like Coy, Kretzer, and Hubbard, fought to the end. They were gunned down in a service corridor, surrounded, wounded, and with no way out. Their last words, according to witnesses: "They won't take us alive." The result was devastating. 3 prisoners dead, 2 guards killed, 14 wounded, and a clear message for the rest of the nation. Even in the most secure prison, nothing was under control. The survivors, Sam Shockley and Miran Thompson, were tried for the riot and executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin. Clarence Carnes, the youngest, was sentenced to life in prison. He was spared for not having killed anyone and for trying to save the hostages. The Battle of Alcatraz left scars. It was the most brutal reminder of what can happen when a group of men decides not to die in a cell. And though time passed, that flame of rebellion remained alive. 16 years later, 3 men would try again, and this time, they would leave no trace. The fugitives. The night of the 11th of June 1962, 3 prisoners disappeared without a trace. Frank Lee Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. None of them were ever seen again. And to this day, their fate remains a mystery. But before talking about the escape, we have to know who they were. And to understand their feat, we must understand their story. John and Clarence Anglin were more than brothers. They were an inseparable duo, adventurous, clever, loyal. They were born into a humble family in the state of Georgia, which later moved to Florida. They grew up in a family of 14 children, out in the countryside. Work in the fields was hard, but they never complained. Their only escape was the water. After long workdays, they would run to swim in the nearest lake. And they weren't amateurs, they were expert swimmers. John even won a competition crossing 650 meters of cold water. Sometimes, they swam in winter, challenging each other to see who could endure the icy water the longest. Unintentional training for what was to come? Maybe. But one thing is certain, in the water, they felt free. At school, things weren't as good. Despite having good grades, the Anglin brothers were constantly teased. Their clothes were old, patched by their mother again and again, and that made them easy targets. One of their sisters recalled it this way: "They hated going to school. They were always teased because of their clothes. My mother did what she could, but they felt ashamed. In the end, they just stopped going. They started skipping classes. They ran away, went swimming. And little by little, they began to steal. First small things, then houses, later, banks, until one day, they committed the crime that would seal their fate. Columbia, Alabama. John, Clarence, and their older brother Alfred decided to make the big move. They robbed a bank and fled with more than $18,000, an enormous sum for the time. From that moment on, a nationwide manhunt began. They tried to hide, change states, go unnoticed. But eventually, they were captured in Ohio. They accepted all the blame without protest. The 3 were sentenced to 35 years in prison. They were sent to the Atlanta Penitentiary, and because of their tendency to escape, they were separated. Alfred stayed there. Clarence was sent to Leavenworth, Kansas, and John to Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. But that didn't stop them. In Lewisburg, John didn't take long to come up with an escape plan. He was discovered before carrying it out. As punishment, he was transferred to Leavenworth, where he was reunited with his brother Clarence after 2 years apart. Together, they tried to escape several times. And that was when the authorities decided to transfer them to the prison from which no one escaped, Alcatraz. John arrived first, in October 1960. Clarence followed 3 months later. On the Rock, John wasn't alone. There, he met a seasoned criminal who would become his ally. James Whitey Bulger, sentenced to 20 years for armed robberies and a failed previous escape. Whitey taught them everything the old-timers knew. How to move around the prison, which guards were tougher, which areas to avoid, how to survive mentally through confinement. When Clarence arrived, he wrote a letter to his mother. "I'm fine. I've already seen John. It's not as cold here as in Leavenworth. I don't have a job yet, but I'll manage." Everything seemed under control, but in silence, the plan was beginning to take shape. And then the third name appeared. Frank Lee Morris. Born in Washington in 1926. His life had been a whirlwind since childhood. He never knew his parents. His mother was an addict, his stepfather violent. Both died when he was 11. From then on, he was raised by the state. He moved from home to home. He kept running away. He ended up in reform schools, then in prisons. Frank Morris was different. Reserved, quiet, observant. He didn't seek company. He didn't trust anyone. But he had something that made him special. An IQ of 133, far above average. And he used that intelligence for one thing only: to escape. He had escaped from several facilities before. Each time, he learned from his mistakes. Each time, he perfected his technique. Whitey Bulger knew him well. He remembers him like this: Frankie wasn't violent. He was brilliant. He escaped because he needed to. It was his way of living. In January 1960, Frank arrived at Alcatraz, a year before the Anglins. From the very first day, he analyzed every corner, every routine, every weakness. He didn't talk much, but he watched and memorized everything. Frank and the Anglins weren't dangerous in the traditional sense. They didn't seek to harm anyone, but they shared one fixed idea: to get out of there. Whitey explained it best. They weren't violent. They were disciplined. They never got into trouble. They had only one obsession: to escape. But there was someone else who would join the group. A lesser-known name: Alan West. Alan Clayton West. A name that rarely appears in headlines, but one that was key in planning the Great Escape. West arrived at Alcatraz in 1954, years before the others. He had a criminal record from a young age: theft, burglary, constant trouble in prison. He was problematic, arrogant, and violent. One of the island's guards said, years later, "I never liked West. He was the only one who truly seemed dangerous to me. He always carried a grudge against the uniform. He was involved in several racial fights, always in the middle of conflict. But interestingly, he already knew Morris and the Anglin brothers. Long before reuniting in Alcatraz, the four had crossed paths in other prisons: the Atlanta Penitentiary and the Rafford Correctional Facility in Florida. That's where the bond was formed. That's where they shared ideas. That's where, probably, it all began. When they met again in Alcatraz, they were no longer just fellow inmates. They were accomplices with a shared past. And then came the big question: when did the escape plan begin? That is what we're going to uncover next: the preparation. The escape plan wasn't born overnight. It was a meticulous project, crafted in silence, piece by piece. It all began shortly after Frank Morris arrived at Alcatraz. He was assigned to the library. There, he met a key inmate, Clarence Joe Kay, head librarian, imprisoned since 1945. Whitey Bulger recalls it. Joe knew the prison like no one else. He knew which guards were strict and which were lazy. He helped Frank because he believed that someday someone would manage to escape, and because he was convinced that Alcatraz's days were numbered. In those first months, the Anglin brothers were not yet on the island, but Alan West was. And it was he who sparked the idea that would ignite the most famous escape in history. February 1960. Frank Morris, Joe Kay, and other inmates were working in the library. Alan West appeared carrying a can of paint. He approached and, in a low voice, said, "I found a way out. There's a vent above Block B. It could be opened. We could get out behind the cells. With dummies in the beds, no one would notice." That's where the plan was born. In a whisper, old rumors said that the ventilation ducts in the ceiling offered a possible escape route, and they were going to find out. The Anglin brothers officially joined the plan in March 1961. Officer Lloyd Miller detected a suspicious conversation between Clarence K., the brothers, and an inmate named June Stevens, a close friend of Clarence Anglin. According to the report, "I saw Stevens speaking quietly with Clarence. Later, he met alone with the Anglin brothers. The conversation was long and confidential. It wasn't a common inmate talk. What was discussed there was never known for sure. But the important thing is that from that moment on, the group was complete. By July 1961, the organization became strategic. The Anglin brothers and Alan West were reassigned to adjoining cells in Block B. John in B150, Clarence in B54, and West in B52. In September, Frank Morris was placed in B138. They were just 5 cells apart. During meals 3 times a day, they met in the cafeteria. Each meeting gave them an hour of planning. They talked about everything: how to build a raft, how to make life vests, how to fool the guards, where to go once they reached land. They even discussed alternative plans. Nothing was left to chance. To achieve their escape, they needed tools. And for that, each one secured a strategic job inside the prison. Frank Morris was assigned to the brush factory on the ground floor of the new industrial building. From there, he hid materials, glue, tools, components. Clarence Anglin became a barber, a key position to collect hair, which they would later use to make fake heads. John Anglin worked in the clothing area, alongside an old acquaintance, Mickey Cohen, the famous Los Angeles mobster. And yes, Mickey Cohen played his part. It's said that thanks to his influence, he helped secure contacts outside the prison. Cohen was the only inmate in the history of Alcatraz to be released on bail. He got out in October 1961 and returned in May 1962. 7 months of freedom, during which he might have prepared something bigger. After the escape, he said, "A lot of blah blah. But those 2 guys were the real deal. They were solid. I want to believe they made it." And he wasn't the only boss involved. There was also Bumpy Johnson, the legendary Harlem mobster. Bumpy Johnson was respected by all the African American inmates. He was a calm, influential man who maintained peace during moments of racial tension. He was often seen walking around the yard with Mickey Cohen, and many suspected that he, too, was involved in the plan. According to some reports, Bumpy might have paid a corrupt guard, used outside contacts to secure a boat for the escape, provided money to help the fugitives, and most impressively, bought the silence of the inmates in the cells behind the conspirators. A former guard said, "Those inmates heard everything. They saw how they moved at night, but they never said a word. I never understood why, until I thought of Bumpy." Back to Clarence, Joe K., the librarian. He was also going to escape, but he started drawing too much attention from the guards. For the good of the group, he decided to step away from the plan. Still, his help was crucial. He knew the prison like the back of his hand. And thanks to him, the others knew exactly what to do. Everything was set in motion. And now came the hardest part, digging the way to freedom, the escape. The night of the 11th of June 1962, the tension in Alcatraz could be cut with a knife. Whitey Bulger still remembers it. The night felt strange, very quiet. Those of us who knew what was coming couldn't sleep. At one point, there was a dull thud on the roof. Then we all started making noise. We shouted, we banged on things, anything to distract the guards. The noise worked. The guards became disoriented, and the block fell silent again. The countdown had begun. 9:30 p.m. The lights go out. The prison sleeps, but 3 men are awake. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers place the fake heads in their beds, and one by one, they slip through the hole behind their cells. They reach the service corridor, where the ventilation ducts run through the building. There, they wait for Alan West. But West doesn't show up. His hole was too narrow. He was stuck. Morris and the Anglins couldn't wait. They knew every second was vital. They continued without him. Frank and the Anglins moved through the service corridor, climbed a pipe, and exited through a ventilation shaft onto the roof. They crossed 30 meters under the cover of night, then descended down a drain pipe to the ground, avoiding 2 fences topped with barbed wire, and reached the northern shore of the island. There, they unfolded their raft made of stolen raincoats. They climbed on, pushed off, and disappeared into the night. They were never seen again. According to Alan West, the plan was to head to Angel Island to avoid being detected. Once on land, they planned to steal clothes, weapons, and a car. Split up, escape in different directions, but another inmate, Woodrow Gay, claimed the plan was different. According to him, John Anglin spoke of going directly to San Francisco because it was a shorter route. They even mentioned the idea of stealing a helicopter, since Morris had read extensively about aviation in the prison library. Final destination? The California desert. Lay low for a few months until the pressure died down, and then go back to robbing banks. The official theory came quickly. They drowned. The FBI found a wooden paddle and some personal belongings floating in the water, but no bodies were ever found. A setup to make people believe they were dead? The truth is, the case became more and more confusing. Over 100 leads were followed across the country. Alleged sightings in bars, hotels, banks. 3 strange men in different cars. Even a postcard sent to the Alcatraz warden. Ah, we made it. Frank, John, and Clarence. The FBI couldn't verify its authorship, but it wasn't the only sign. More than a decade later, Clarence K. claimed to have received a postcard with the words, "Gone fishing," a code to confirm they were alive. A San Francisco lawyer also received a phone call. "This is John Anglin. Call the marshals. Don't ask questions. You know who I am? Read the newspaper." The FBI installed wiretaps in her office. But he never called again. The leads became increasingly unsettling. The older brother, Robert Anglin, confessed on his deathbed, "I've been with the boys. They made it." There were also mysterious signs for their mother. Every year, on her birthday, she received red roses, always with 2 unsigned cards. Even after her death in 1973, she also received Christmas postcards with no postmarks, and phone calls where only breathing could be heard. Then came the most surprising piece of evidence. Fred Brizzi, a childhood friend of the Anglins and a former drug trafficker, claimed to have seen them in the 1970 seconds on a rural farm in Brazil. He showed a photo taken in 1975. 2 men in the Brazilian countryside. Could they be John and Clarence? 25 years later, the image was analyzed by facial recognition experts. The result? By all probabilities, the men in the photo were indeed the Anglin brothers. What happened to Frank Morris? Brizzi mentioned that there was a 3rd man with the Anglins in Brazil, but he never revealed his identity. In 1967, a man called the authorities. He claimed to be a former classmate of Frank Morris and said he had seen him in Maryland with a beard and mustache. There was also a man named Bud Morris, Frank's cousin, who declared he had met him in a San Diego park shortly after the escape. But nothing was ever confirmed. And that's all that is known about Frank Morris. Whitey Bulger, one of the last living witnesses of it all, left his own conclusion. The warden wanted to believe they drowned. I believe they made it without a problem. They stole a car. They got away fast. They had detailed plans, escape routes, faces, backup. They knew how not to raise suspicion. And, most importantly, they cut all ties with their families. Not to disappear, but to protect them. They had no choice. It was that, or risk having their loved ones pressured by the government. Frank had an advantage. He had no one. But the brothers, they sacrificed everything. And that's why I believe they lived in freedom. And they were happy. Every time I remember that morning of June 12, I smile in silence. I applaud Frankie, John, and Clarence. Because they made history. And they helped close Alcatraz. And so ended the greatest escape ever recorded on American soil. An unsolved mystery. A symbol of resistance. And perhaps, a story of freedom. The legacy of Alcatraz. Alcatraz was more than a prison. It was a symbol of power, of isolation, and finally, of defeat. The escape of Morris and the Anglin brothers was not only a milestone, but it also exposed the cracks in the system. Shortly after, the prison began to decay. The costs were unsustainable. The security was no longer infallible. And in 1963, Alcatraz closed its doors forever. Today, its walls still stand. But they no longer hold criminals. They hold stories, echoes, secrets, and the legend of the only escape that was never solved. And that's where this documentary ends. If the story captivated you, if you enjoyed every detail, I invite you to give it a like, leave your comment, and share the video. It's the best way to support this work and help more people discover this incredible story. This more cinematic style was an experiment. And if you liked it, let me know below. See you very soon with a new story that will send shivers down your spine. Thank you for watching, and long live those who dare to defy the impossible.